Let's say your head was on fire and everyone was aware of it but you. You went about your life as if everything was normal, go to work, pick up the kids from school, and everyone around you is saying, "Oh my God, dude, your head is on fire." They're all alarmed, they're all worried about you, and you're just like, "What are you talking about? Everything is fine. Nothing has changed. Everything is normal." That's essentially what anosognosia is like. Anosognosia is a symptom of psychosis that causes a person to lose awareness of their mental state. So they could be having hallucinations and delusions and other symptoms that put them into a separate reality aside from what everyone else is experiencing. And to anyone else, it would look like they had lost control, but to them, they're themselves. They're as true to themselves as they've ever been, and everything around them is chaotic, but they are totally fine. Basically, they've become fully engaged in their own false reality and have lost the perception that anything has changed. When I've had anosognosia, there is nothing anyone could have told me that would make me believe that I was psychotic. And people would try to tell me that I was psychotic. They would say, "Carolyn, it's a delusion. It's not real. You're just in psychosis." And I would think, "No, you're lying to me. You're wrong. I'm a prophet. I'm a god. I'm dead." And that was my reality. There was no negating it. There was no way, even with proof, that you could tell me I was psychotic and I would believe you. Now, my reality was chaotic. Don't get me wrong. The things that were happening were not normal. It's not normal to think that you're seeing shadow people because most people don't see that. But to me, I had just been spiritually reborn. I had all these explanations for why it made sense. And even though all of these things had changed and all of these drastic events were happening, I had seamlessly gone from my usual stable state to anosognostic, I guess, if you could call it that. And that change was so subtle that I didn't realize anything had happened to me, and I thought I was myself. In fact, I felt like my truest self. I had never been more me than I was in anosognosia. So in that sense, I could have been walking around with my head on fire and I wouldn't have known it. People could try to tell me to dunk my head in water and I wouldn't understand why they were saying that. I'd think, "That's so foolish. Why would you think that? You're silly." I would be the last person to know. And that's just how that works. It's a lack of awareness. So if you could put yourself in the shoes of the person with the burning head, you can understand a little bit what it's like to have anosognosia. Psychotic depression, what is it? So, psychotic depression is a very severe form of depression that has psychotic features. So while it is still depression, it also has hallucinations and delusions and other psychotic symptoms. It is different from typical psychosis in that the depression is the dominant feature. The key term to understand here is mood congruent. When it comes to psychotic episodes that are mixed with a mood episode, there are two different ways that one can experience their symptoms. They could be mood congruent symptoms or mood incongruent symptoms. Mood congruent symptoms are symptoms that align with the mood. So if the mood were to be manic, the symptoms could be like delusions of grandeur and thinking you're a god and really elevated, heightened, ecstatic things like that. Whereas in a depressive episode, there could be more persecutory delusions of having illnesses because that is aligned with the depression. Mood incongruence is on the flip side of that. So mood incongruence would be the opposite of whatever mood state a person was in. Say they were depressive, their symptoms would be reflected as delusions of grandeur, like you might see in mania. This does not necessarily align with the typical symptoms of depression. And the reason this is so important to understand is that psychotic depression is identifiable by the mood congruent symptoms. Now, what would those symptoms look like? Well, consider that when a person is in depression, they typically have symptoms of low self-worth and lethargy and suicidal ideation. These are all amplified in psychosis. So if a person already has a sense of poor self-worth, they may have delusions of being like a bad guy or committing crimes that they didn't actually commit, or doing harm where there was no harm done. They could have persecutory delusions of being preyed upon, being spied on, being followed, heightened paranoia, any kind of negative experience you could imagine in psychosis. This is the kind of situation where that would happen. Hallucinations are not typically as common in psychotic depression as delusions are, and the delusions may have some small basis in reality. For instance, if a person struggles with their financial stability, they may have delusions that they are completely impoverished and homeless, even if they have a home. It could amplify whatever stressor is happening in their life. And that's important to note because psychotic depression can be triggered by stressors that would put a person into a depressive state, put a person into a very stressful state. Could be grief, could be health problems, financial problems, relationship problems, could be any number of things like a past traumatic experience that would bring upon such an intense depression that you might slip into psychosis. It also may have genetic factors. It may be hereditary. It could be something that was passed down within your family. Typically, people who have history of depression in their family are more likely to develop psychotic depression than people who have a history of psychosis or schizophrenia in their family history. From my experience with psychotic depression, it was so dark. And this was when my psychosis was at its absolute scariest. The delusions I was having were really violent, and they were in a sense related to the struggles I was having in my life, though I may not have realized that at the time. For instance, I was in an abusive relationship and I was in this terrible marriage. I was having delusions that my ex-husband was a demon who was trying to torture me, and I would think that he was dead and I had killed him. And some people have speculated that that may have been a response in my brain telling me to get out. If so, thank you, brain. That's exactly what I needed. So there were factors, but in that state, I never would have been able to tell. Also, I just want to note that everybody's experience with psychosis is different. It is a spectrum. There are so many different ways that you can experience psychosis, and this is by no means the absolute experience that everyone can have. These are just some factors. So there could be other things that come into play with psychotic depression. You may not necessarily have associations with these factors, but nonetheless, this is what I've found, and this is what I have to share with you. When it comes to classifying psychosis, there's a lot of different terminology that gets thrown around. So while a lot of people will experience psychosis in their lifetime, they may have different diagnoses like schizoaffective, bipolar with psychotic features, and schizophrenia. And I get it, it is kind of a lot. But there is one key feature to understanding the difference between these disorders, and that is a person's mood state. I made this little chart to kind of better explain how a person's mood state plays into their experience with psychosis and ultimately their diagnosis, because it helps. I think it helps. So on one side of this mood presence scale, you have 0, no mood present, no significant major altered mood, no mania, depression, just simply the psychotic symptoms. And then on this end, you have total mood. Total mood, the psychotic episode is always present with a mood. So it could be a manic episode or a depressive episode, but the psychosis always happens with a mood. What this means is that along this scale, people will have varying degrees of mood episodes which determine their diagnosis. So for people who have bipolar with psychotic features, their psychotic episodes always happen with a mood state, and they can also have mood episodes outside of psychosis, but they won't have psychosis outside of moods. Whereas people with schizoaffective can have both. They can have psychosis with or without mood states, and that is what gives the diagnosis, is being able to determine if they can have a mood episode in their psychotic episode, have an absence of a mood episode, and et cetera, et cetera. It's like a very fine-tuned diagnosis, but essentially that is what it is. And then schizophrenia is when a person may have a mood present, but it's not the predominant feature. It's not the main element in the psychotic episode determining their symptoms, because with the schizoaffective and bipolar, the depression and mania will determine how the symptoms play out. They may have grandiose delusions if they're manic, or they may have more dark, despairing delusions when they're depressed, like persecutory delusions of being preyed upon. Whereas with schizophrenia, those symptoms aren't determined by the mood, they just are what they are. So I hope that better explains how that works. Psychosis is a varied experience for everyone. Everyone's experience is unique to them, and there are so many features involved in psychosis beyond just the positive and negative symptoms. There are a lot of ways that it can play out, and these are just some of them. Schizophrenia isn't the only psychotic disorder. In fact, schizophrenia is actually a spectrum of many psychotic disorders that all have different features and contributing factors to what causes them and how they play out. Psychosis in itself is a varied experience for everyone who has it. So it's natural that there are lots of fluctuations in the symptoms, how they change over time. So schizophrenia spectrum disorders are just a multitude of ways that a person can experience psychosis. Up until relatively recently, schizophrenia was divided into 5 subtypes. Those subtypes are residual, paranoid, catatonic, undifferentiated, and disorganized. I'd be happy to go into depth on those 5 subtypes in a different video, but today we're talking about the spectrum, not the subtypes, so we'll stick to that. This was the standard up until 2013. So before 2013, people were diagnosed with these subtypes, and say if you had paranoid symptoms, you would be diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. But this was changed with the most recent DSM to become a spectrum, in part because people's subtypes would change over time. Their symptoms would evolve over time. And so you wouldn't just be one subtype your whole life necessarily. There could be fluctuation in your symptoms. And this evolved into encompassing many more disorders that have different features altogether. Now, as far as disorders go in length of time, there are varying disorders that are classified by how long the psychotic symptoms are present. So starting with the least amount of time for symptoms to be present, there is brief psychotic disorder. This is a disorder typically caused by extreme stress, and the symptoms must be present for at least a day, but lasting less than a month. From then on, you have schizophreniform psychotic disorder, or schizophreniform disorder. I don't have my notes with me, so bear with me. Schizophreniform disorder is an episode lasting up to 6 months, anywhere from a month to up to 6 months. If it goes into the territory of lasting over 6 months, that would be considered schizophrenia. And then of course, when you get the mood episodes involved, that's an entirely different beast. Schizoaffective disorder is a combination of mood disorder symptoms and schizophrenia symptoms. So the mood disorder could be bipolar, it could be major depressive disorder. It is essentially psychotic episodes with mania or depression present. I didn't find bipolar with psychotic features listed in the list of psychotic disorders that fall under the schizophrenia spectrum, but I feel like it should be included. Just my 2 cents, because it is very similar to schizoaffective in that it does have psychotic symptoms present with mood episode symptoms. There's also delusional disorder, which I'd love to dive further into in another video. And delusional disorder is a disorder in which delusions are present for at least a month without any other schizophrenia symptoms. And the delusions cannot be explained by any other medical condition. It is on its own a disorder made up of delusions. Then there's substance-induced psychotic disorder, which is a psychotic episode that is caused by medication or any other substance This can last as long as it takes to get off of that substance, or it might need some kind of medical intervention like electroconvulsive therapy or medication, hospitalization, but typically it does resolve without the use of that substance. Also, you can have a psychotic disorder due to another medical condition. This can be caused, for instance, by a traumatic brain injury. And then there is one disorder that kind of falls in and out of the spectrum because it has psychotic features, but it is actually a personality disorder, and this is schizotypal personality disorder. Schizotypal personality disorder is characterized by odd thinking or speech patterns, unusual beliefs, and paranoia. So that is what the schizophrenia spectrum entails, and it is an ever-evolving thing. There are a lot of different ways to experience psychosis. I've talked about blip psychosis, for instance. I've talked about psychosis with dementia, which I feel like would be a psychotic disorder due to another medical condition. There are just a million ways that you can experience psychosis, and it is by no means limited to any one disorder.